being in their presence or being able to touch them.
Often, a relic would be a fragment of bone or a piece of a saint's clothing. Sometimes, it would have been more gruesome, like a severed head. The relics were so important to the Templars, they were taken into battle to provide divine guidance. But the ultimate relics were those of Jesus Christ himself.
We can't have relics of our Lord because he was ascended into heaven. And so we've latched on to the things which are closest to them. And for many, of course, the cup of the Last Supper is something which is very important.
This cup, the Holy Grail, has for centuries been the subject of mythology. It is claimed the Templars, in their search for relics, unearthed the Holy Grail at Temple Mount. This became their most sacred possession, which they guarded with their lives. But there is little evidence that this persistent legend is true.
This was the invention of a 12th century French Romance writer called Chrétien de Troyes. The Templars could never have had hold of this thing that goes back centuries, back to the time of Christ.
In the Middle Ages, there were people who we would call today fantasy writers, who apparently thought that it would be really cool to connect the ideas of the Holy Grail with the ideas of the Templars.
It seems linking the mysterious and secretive Templars with the greatest icon in Christendom was the ultimate medieval fantasy.
The trouble is it takes on a life of its own, goes on, and then people start to believe it, but it's fantasy.
By stripping away the modern settlements, we can reveal Chastel-Blanc as the Templars would have known it. On top of the steeply sided hill, protected by double concentric walls, the fortified church was fantastically defended. This centerpiece of the network links the headquarters at Tortosa to the rest of the Christian defenses. But just 25 miles away is the world's finest castle, Croix de Chevalier, built to withstand the most brutal attack. Lawrence of Arabia described Croix de Chevalier as the finest castle in the world. With outer walls 100 feet thick and 7 guard towers 30 feet in diameter, this castle was virtually impregnable. The fortress was constructed and manned by the Hospitallers, partners and rivals of the Templars. Its location is crucial. It defends the most important trade route in the region.
Over there, you have the long valley with the main road. It's a main road today, and it was a main road in medieval time, linking the coast to the inland cities, which in the Crusader period were the centers of Islamic power, and the coast was the center of the Crusader power.
The Hospitallers and the Templars joined forces to defend this important territory. This was a massive military operation, and David Nicole is on a quest to find out how the knights operated. Horses were essential to the holy warriors, but stabling the animals was a major undertaking.
The first of 2 stables. This one is the smaller of the 2. Still pretty big.
These magnificent vaulted buildings could stable up to 1,000 horses. From here, they could be out and in battle in minutes.
They are quite literally chomping at the bit. They're probably as eager as the men who are going to ride them to get out there and get into action.
Horses were also essential to transport weapons, food, and men around the castle. The designers of Croix de Chevalier had to find a way of allowing the animals to move around the steep inclines of the fortress. They solved the problem by constructing the passages as long, shallow steps instead of slopes.
By having these relatively shallow steps, it reduces the slope, which makes it easier for the animals. And of course, it gets wet, it gets slippery, and if you've got that many animals, you're going to have an awful lot of animal dung.
Moving men about the castle was just as important, especially when under attack.
We're deep inside this really, really thick, solid piece of masonry.
This is known as a gallery wall, a secret passage within the broad fortifications, allowing the knights to move clandestinely around the castle in times of attack.
They'd like to keep it as hidden as possible from the enemy. Imagine yourself being under attack, people racing backwards and forwards with new arrows for the crossbowmen, or bringing water or food to them, or help to the injured. There's going to be a lot of activity going on during a siege.
Knights would be manning not only the arrow slits, but an ingenious piece of high-tech medieval engineering known as machicolations. Machicolations protrude from the castle walls. They are a cunning anti-tunneling measure.
If you could get above them and then drop rocks or indeed anything nasty on top of them, boiling water, forget the boiling oil, that's far, far too expensive to waste. But I think some boiling water on top of the enemy miners' heads could be quite effective. That'll put them off.
But the greatest example of military engineering at Croix de Chevalier is the great sloping wall that surrounds the central keep. Known as a talus, it prevented the enemy undermining the towers.
The idea being that if you do penetrate into that, it all falls down on top of you.
Despite the web of fortifications, by 1187 the tide was turning against the Templars. Their great enemy Saladin swept through the Holy Land, grabbing town after town from the Christians. Ultimately, he captured Jerusalem. Within months, his army was at the gates of Tortosa, the Templars' military headquarters. The city fell, but the knights managed to shelter within the castle. The Templars needed to regroup. They set about rebuilding their fortifications. David Nicole is searching for clues as to how they reinforced Tortosa.
Now, this diagonal line here is a beautiful clue. I think you can say with reasonable certainty that that marks the line of the talus that went around the base of this tower.
This talus meant Tortosa would now resist an enemy attempting to undermine its walls. Inside, David Nicole makes another discovery. It is clear the inner section of the keep, containing a weapon store and cistern, is surrounded by a later fortification.
What the Templars do is build this extra bit on the outside. They strengthen and greatly enlarge this. And on the outside of that, the sea. The whole structure is now very strong indeed.